Hello everyone, my name's Louise Chappell and with Fiona Mackay from Edinburgh University, we're hosting this evening's relaunch of the FIIN website and the Oxford University Press series in feminist institutionalism. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm here in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people, which has been unceded, and pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present. I'm welcoming all of you from wherever you are across the globe. I guess one of the good things about the pandemic is that we're much better with connecting with everyone from wherever you are and enabling people who would not otherwise be able to come to face-to-face events to be able to enjoy these connections that we're able to make through these sessions such as tonight. No event such as this happens without huge support in the background, and tonight I'd really like to thank Alison Nolan, to thank Sarah Easy, James Ridley, to thank Greg Archibald and the whole team who are with us in the studio here in Sydney tonight, making these events happen. I'd now like to just welcome my dear friend and colleague, Fiona Mackay from Edinburgh.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks to the whole team behind the event. Hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here, to take stock, to look forward to a new phase of the FI journey. And before we move on, I'd like to introduce our fellow co-directors and co-conspirators. So that's Georgina Whalen from Manchester University, Ellen Bjarnegard from Uppsala University, and Meryl Kenny from Edinburgh University. It's just been such a privilege to work on this collective enterprise with you all and so many others, as well as just a lot of fun. So back to Louise.
Thanks, Fiona. So I'll just run through the agenda that we have for you today. We're going to start with a roundtable discussion with a number of those key colleagues who have been with the Feminist Institutionalism Network from the start, just to understand where we came from and where we're going and what we still need to do. We'll follow this with a launch of the Oxford University Press book series, and we're delighted that feminist institutionalist pioneer Johnny Lewandowski will be assisting us in that launch. We'll then go to our first panel of up-and-coming feminist institutionalist scholars to get a take on their approach to using this conceptual framework and methodology, and then have some case studies and have a few colleagues share their ideas with us from those. And we'll then have a brief run through of the new website so you can see how to navigate that before Fiona and I will wrap up. Throughout the event tonight, the chat is open, so please put your comments and questions in there and we'll endeavour to answer you throughout the discussion. So before we move to that roundtable, I thought I'd just take a moment to get Fiona's perspective of the early days of feminist institutionalism and what brought you to it, Fiona, and your reflections on its development.
Thanks, Louise. I was thinking about it, and I guess it was born in part from a certain sense of frustration at what I saw as the limitations of the kinds of tools and frameworks that I seem to have at my disposal as an empirical feminist political scientist. So the field then was still very dominated by social movement theory, talking about political opportunity structures, various sorts of enabling and constraining variables, and so on and so forth. And at the turn of the century, and I don't know how I've just had to say that, but the late 1990s into the 2000s, I was studying institutional restructuring and institutional change, in particular the creation of the new political institutions of devolution in the UK and the Scottish Parliament in particular. And I needed to be able to understand what happened next. So what happened after institutional creation? You know, how would the new Scottish Parliament and its new institutional rules and norms about gender equality, gender quotas, gender mainstreaming, how would they fare over the long haul? And I wanted more insight into, A, the determinants of continuity and change over time, and B, how do new political institutions, and how are they enacted on a daily basis? What are the gendered patterns of reform and resistance? What are the interplay of old rules and new rules, old institutions and new institutions? And what would be the outcomes for gender equality and gender justice? So I was inspired by Johnny Lewandowski's 1998 call for feminists to engage with new institutionalism. And I began reading mainly historical institutionalists, so Thalen, Mahoney, Pearson, and a bit later sociological institutionalists like Campbell. And I had just lots of aha moments. I could see points of connection and concern, aplenty between NI scholars and institutionally focused feminist political scientists. But I was also struck that with the exception of one or two instances, there was an absolute gender blindness. So there was an absence of looking at gender equality as a substantive issue, or as gender as an analytical lens. So I guess at that point, others were already beginning to explore the potential and limits of NI. So I'm thinking of people like you, Louise, and your Gender in Government book, Laurel Weldon and Johanna Cantala's first books, Georgina Whalen's project on gender and democratisation, and of course Amy Mazur and her collaborators with the Rings Network about women's policy machinery. So the moment seemed ripe, didn't it, in those early 2000s to begin to network and to share ideas about the potential for a synthesis and the creation of a feminist institutionalism. Meanwhile, here at Edinburgh, a brilliant young PhD student called Meryl Kenny joined me, and as they say, the rest is history. What about you, Louise?
So for me, as an Australian feminist doing my PhD in the 1990s, I could not avoid discussion about feminism and the state, and leading scholars such as Marion Saw's work was very influential. But I was looking for a conceptual framework to work with, and I remember being in a PhD seminar and someone said to me, I think historical institutionalism is going to be really helpful for you in trying to untangle why the Australian and Canadian feminist movements were so different. So I started reading, like you, Thalen and Steinmo and Olsen and others, and they were really gelling with me. I was really taken with their sort of understanding of the way institutions operate and the layering of those institutions and so on. But like you, also staggered that there was nothing around gender in terms of informal rules and so on. Olsen's work in particular, I remember sort of throwing it across the room, getting quite agitated about the lack of understanding of the importance that gender plays. So I then read Mary Katzenstein's amazing book, Faithful and Fearless, and her work was just an absolute eye-opener for me in terms of trying to excavate what's happening under the surface. And so I took up her work. I was really influenced by Jill Vickers' work and Leanne Banaszak's work on multi-level governance and federalisms in particular. Karen Beckwith's work on comparative politics and gender was also really important to me. So trying to bring those all together in that first book that I wrote, but also since then, has been really, really important. And it's just so exciting to see that early work now sort of developing into things that are much more sophisticated than anything that I could have imagined in those early days. So I just want to note that we are missing some of those early voices tonight. A key founder of this network, Mona-Lena Crook, couldn't join us. Vivian Lowndes can't be with us either. Petra Meyer, Amy Mazur, Tanya Verge, Joan Grace, and some other pioneers have been unable to take up the invitation to be here. So we will add their voices to the website, and I do hope you're able to listen to them once those pieces are available. But Fiona, now I'm going to move on to the next segment of our program tonight, and that is to move on to the roundtable with some of those who were very much part of those early days and created some of that foundational work. So I'd like to introduce Georgina Whalen, Johanna Cantler and Ellen Bjarnegard, and also we will have some words from Laurel Weldon as well. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being part of our event tonight. I have 3 questions for you, and I just want to put them out there and allow you to answer them in the way that you would see fit. So what has FI given you? What's different about that approach than others that you had engaged with before? What do you think some of the important breakthroughs have been? But also, what are the limitations, and where do you think we still need to go to further develop this as a useful conceptual and methodological framework? So I'd like to start with you, Georgina, if you'd like to give us some comments.
Great. Thanks, Louise. And it's great to be here, and FIIN has come so far and FI has come so far in really what's quite a short period of time. And I'm going to talk about 4 things that are important for me. Firstly, for me, 2 key insights of FI. And speaking as someone who does problem-driven research, for me, one of the key elements of FI, which Louise and Fiona have sort of touched on, is its explanatory power. And for me, that's important in 2 ways. Firstly, it helps us, as they've both stressed, to better explain outcomes. Why is it, for example, that some feminist actors who are influential and tried their best to achieve positive change sometimes fail? And it's not just to do with them. The institutional context stymies them. And that helped to reverse, I think, an overemphasis on actors that we have sometimes had in the past. And secondly, again, echoing what Louise and Fiona have said, FI emphasises the informal rules and norms. And one of the key insights of FI is to highlight the importance of those rules and norms, whatever we want to call them. And I think we all knew this implicitly. It helps us to understand why the implementation of formal rules sometimes fails, because it's undermined by those informal rules. But it's now much easier to express that in analytical terms, talking as Fiona did about the previously neglected informal rules and norms that can undermine things. And I think this is useful in a range of contexts, the global north and the global south. I've recently been working with some legal scholars looking at the experiences of women judges in 5 fragile and conflict-afflicted states in Latin America, Africa and Asia. And in that project, looking at how the informal norms and practices play out differently in each country has been a very helpful tool in understanding how the different judiciaries are gendered. I think, secondly, an area that needs more work is how to do FI, but methods. We're still working on this, particularly how to research informal institutions. They're quite tricky. By definition, they're difficult to get at. And we've done some great work already using ethnography. But I've recently been looking at practice theory, how to research and understand everyday practices of actors. I'm thinking here of people like Vincent Puglio in IR and diplomatic studies, who's been putting practice theory together with historical institutionalism to help look at the selection processes for the UN Secretary General. I think that can be a useful avenue. And I'll just finally, quickly, because I can see I'm running out of time, make 2 observations. For me, FI is not homogeneous. There's not one FI narrowly specified. There's a fundamental body of agreement and understanding of institutions as gendered rules, norms and practices that are centrally important. But within that, I think there's variation. And one important area where there is this variation is the relative importance of actors versus institutions. And I think there's a bit of a continuum between those who attribute more perhaps to institutional constraints and those who attribute more to sort of actors' agency. And I'm probably more towards the actor end. I think if you look at the current UK government travails with Boris Johnson, you can see how hugely influential he is in creating chaos and mayhem. But of course, Boris Johnson is still constrained by institutions. And the second caveat for me is it's a small one, but I think perhaps something we ought to bear in mind, that FI is an approach, it's an analytical lens, and it's very important to answer some very important questions. But for me, the problem and the question must be the starting point, and that leads and influences the choice of approach and method. And it's obviously more complicated than that. What questions you ask are going to be determined to some extent by the sort of methods and approach you use. But I think I would say we have to bear in mind that well, for me anyway, I want to start with the questions and the problems and then find the approach that works for best answering that question. But overall, FI, I think, has significantly changed the way that feminist political scientists, many of them, approach our questions and approach our research. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. Really insightful as ever. I could listen to you talk all day, but we have many other wonderful colleagues to listen to as well. So I'm going to hand over now to Johanna Cantler, and how would you answer those questions, Johanna?
Thank you so much, Louise and Fiona. And I want to start by congratulating all of you. It's really amazing where you have come with feminist institutionalism. And I'm really speaking as someone who has maybe been there since the beginning, but I see myself really benefiting from your research. And I see it especially acutely now, Louise, with regards to your question that what feminist institutionalism has given to my research. So for the past 3.5 years, I have been busy with studying gender and democracy in the European Parliament within the framework of the so-called EU Gender Project. And we study political parties, political groups, and their gendered practices and policies. So feminist institutionalism has been the leading theoretical framework or analytical lens and inspiration for many of our articles, and now for the book that I try to work on. So for me, when I thought of it for this roundtable, I thought that it has enabled us to make contributions both to gender and politics research, and then also to mainstream EU studies. And in relation to gender and politics, I'm someone who comes from a post-structural, constructivist, discursive, theoretical background. So maybe adding to what Fiona was saying about social movement studies, and then what Georgina, you were saying about kind of an actor focus. So I've kind of traditionally had this focus on discourses and ideas and constructions. So FI has really enabled me to focus on practices, what Georgina mentioned as well. So the institutionalized effects of these discourses and constructions. And I think this has been the contribution to gender and politics debates that it has given to me. And secondly, I also feel that feminist institutionalism has made it, if not easy, at least possible to communicate with an effective analytical framework the findings that we have had to this mainstream political science or European studies audience. So, for example, we've been looking at the impact of radical right populism in the European Parliament on political groups. And we have also analyzed very kind of basic questions about how these political groups in the European Parliament form. And FI has always enabled us to contribute this focus not just on formal, but also on informal institutions. So the second point I wanted to make is about how feminist institutionalism has been very central to one fundamental topic that has underpinned our research, and it's that of democracy. And democracy, including the current backlashes and the resilience of democratic political institutions within the European Union and European Parliament. So here I felt that feminist institutionalism has really provided quite a unique lens for us. So a focus on political parties as democratic actors, it may be self-evident for many feminist institutionalist scholars, yet we have found that this is not the typical way to frame questions about democracy in the context of European Parliament. So there's a lot of focus on rule of law debates in member states and things like input and output legitimacy of political institutions. But feminist institutionalism makes it possible to really study European Parliament's political groups as democratic actors. So how their democratic character is undermined and supported by formal or informal institutions, and how gender practices and gender equality practices become questions of well-functioning democracies. So this focus and developing this notion of democratic practices within parliaments and political groups, there's a real contribution, I think, where FI has helped us. And my time is also running out. So just one kind of concluding thought, which is not about limitations of FI, but very much in line with what Georgina said about kind of future directions. So we know from Fiona, Louise, the pioneers, that an informal institution is not, for example, actors or networks. I'd like to say that it's also not discourses or effects and emotions. So I see a lot of potential in developing these notions of discursive practices, effective practices, and the way that they shape our political institutions parallel to the notion of informal institutions. So opening up new avenues, methodologically and theoretically. Thank you.
That's wonderful, and such an important point you make there, Johanna, that we definitely do need to take that more seriously. So thank you very much for that. Now to Ellen Bjarnegard. Ellen, I'll leave it to you to answer one or all of those questions.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, really good questions. And I came to feminist institutionalism via informal institutions primarily, because as I was working with my PhD thesis, I had to make sense somehow type politics and its persistent male dominance. And so I felt I had to focus, or I understood I needed to focus on the unspoken rules here. And I became more and more convinced that informal institutions were key for understanding both the political system, but also the gendered patterns. But it was actually not until Georgina, who was the external examiner of my PhD thesis, until she pointed out to me that there's, a way, there's a name, and there's an agenda that's emerging, suggesting that institutionalism and gender are intrinsically linked. And that's what I worked with ever since. So for me, I think feminist institutionalism gave me and contributed with that much needed middle ground that many of you have alluded to between structures and individuals. It kind of pinpoints a political logic that helps us explain daily practices and behavior, not in the sense that everyone has to follow the rules, but in the sense that everyone has to relate to them somehow and assess the costs of potentially not following them. And this perspective, I think, is so crucial for understanding gendered relationships and outcomes. So for me, feminist institutionalism did and continues to do just that. And I think this focus on the institutions and on the logic makes it easier also to bring in a study of political privilege, a study of masculinities as a political logic that ultimately tends to benefit men, at least some men. And I also think that a feminist institutionalism perspective is important in the way that it puts a name on institutions. We have to struggle sometimes to name the institutions that we see, but when we manage, it renders them comparable across contexts. And I mean, for me, feminist institutionalism has been crucial for studying contexts in which formal institutions are weak, semi-democratic, or weak states in general, often in the global South. It is useful because it gives you a way of studying how there are, nevertheless structures and logics that rule them. And I think many of my colleagues in the global South have also pointed out this, that it really resonates and explains patterns that they have seen, and many practitioner organizations have also adopted an institutional language and sees this as a way of talking about change and when and why it happens and why it doesn't. So I really think that feminist institutionalism already does, to some extent, build bridges where we discuss institutions across contexts in the global North and the global South. I think it already also is used in practice work. And I think it is starting to to focus on men and masculinities as that kind of other part of the gendered focus. But I also think these are probably some of the areas where there's still a lot of work to be done, and where I still think that we can and should push forward. Feminist institutionalism can still do much more to investigate how institutions affect men and masculinities. We see how they are gendered to the masculine, I think, but to actually see how they affect men, we can still work more with that. And again, although this field, more than many others, I think, do have scholarly discussions across different contexts, we can still do much more both to integrate scholarship on the global north and on the global south with this common language that we have. It gives us a framework for doing so, but it's not used enough, I think. And it's also clear that the diversity of the scholars and the perspectives that scholars from the global south could bring to feminist institutionalism can certainly be improved. So I think those are areas for where a lot of future work remains.
Thanks, Ellen. I think you're absolutely right in that focus in your own work, which has been so influential on masculinities and cases in the global south. I think it's really shown us a path for making FI much more global and much more intersectional. And now I'd like to ask that we hear from Laurel Weldon. This is a pre-record of Laurel because of challenging time differences, who is going to talk to us a little bit more about that intersectional need of FI in terms of taking it forward.
Hi, Louise. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm also very appreciative of the opportunity to live and work on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, as you can see behind me, coming to you from British Columbia, Canada. I wanted to take up the issue that you mentioned about what intersectionality adds to our study of gender in institutions. And just, you know, in the very brief time we have, I want to say, so intersectionality offers both analytic and political benefits to the feminist institutional perspective. The analytic benefit, of course, is a fullest understanding of gender. If feminist institutionalism aims to bring a fuller understanding of institutions and how they work by incorporating dimensions of gender, then it must incorporate elements of race, ethnicity, nationality, and the like in order to offer a full picture of the way that these norms shape institutions. If institutions, informal or formal, represent kind of rules of appropriate behavior around which expectations converge for a given identity, appropriate behavior for a given identity, then it seems clear that there's no way that we can really understand that in terms of its application to actual people without understanding the ways that gender identities, for example, and gender norms are complicated by race, by ethnicity, by nationality, by citizenship, by all of these things. So if what we care about is this fuller understanding of norms, we have to understand how these intersecting structures shape those norms. This is a kind of a core element of gender. If feminist institutionalism aims to uncover the secret garden of institutions, the things that are hidden, the things that keep it going, then the questions about race, ethnicity, the obscured, elited, the marginalized, the silenced, these excluded, these are the most hidden, the most secret gardens of institutionalism. So those are actually analytic benefits, but there are political benefits as well. When we surface the experience of marginalized and excluded groups, we enrich our discipline, of course, but we also, in terms of its analytic reach, but we also include a broader group of perspectives in our purview, and we make our field one that is less dominated as the knowledge of the powerful and opens up more to different sources of knowledge, different perspectives, different understandings. And that has a kind of political benefit as well, a benefit of inclusion. I think as FIIN scholars engage more with the experiences and perspectives on these sorts of issues that arise from intersectionally marginalized groups. It could also be intersectionally privileged groups. Ellen Hancock makes the point that intersectionality isn't a content specialty in marginalized groups, but as we pay attention to the ways that these dimensions intersect, we reveal hidden dimensions that we would not otherwise understand. And this greatly enriches the feminist institutionalist project. It's a little vague, but if we had more time, I'd love to give you some examples. So for now, I'll just say back to you, Louise.
Well, thank you to all of you on this panel. I think it's really helped us think about what we've learned already, but also some key pointers about the way in which we need to move forward around feminist institutionalism. And we're going to hear more about that as we go through our program tonight. So I would like to hand over now for our next segment, which Ellen and Meryl are going to host for us, and that is to launch the Oxford University Press book series. So over to you, Meryl and Ellen. Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, and as a beginning of the launch of this new book series, it's my great pleasure to introduce a conversation between Meryl Kenny and a person who was the feminist institutionalism before we had a name for it, Johnny Lewandowski. And they will, in this conversation, take us on a journey from the origins of feminist institutionalism to where we are today, an established field about to launch our own book series. So over to you.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Meryl Kenny. I'm a co-director of the Feminism and Institutionalism International Network and also senior lecturer in gender and politics at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm here in conversation with Professor Johnny Lewandowski, who is Professor Emerita of Politics at Birkbeck, University of London, and visiting professor at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. So, Johnny, you're widely seen in the field as one of the pioneers of feminist institutionalism, and your work has inspired a multitude of research in the field. I know for me, your 1995 book with Pippa Norris on political recruitment, gender, race, and class in the British Parliament, and your 1998 review on gendering research and political science greatly shaped my own thinking and work on feminist institutionalism, and specifically on the formal and informal dynamics of political parties. So reflecting back, I wondered if you might talk a bit about how you came to institutionalism.
Well, feminist political science was always something I wanted. It was a project for me. And I wanted to change things. And I knew that I had to start from where I was. So I was motivated to understand the context and power imbalances between women and men, starting from essentially an institutionalist training. So in practice, this meant understanding institutions and how they produced and reproduced power and how that power was gendered. And it took a while to get there because other things were happening. And at first, my choice of preoccupations, the things that I chose to study and look at, was pretty intuitive. And I made assumptions about institutions that I later had to revisit and interrogate. And in fact, I'm still doing that, still revisiting and interrogating old assumptions. Also, I had a really early interest in the nature of masculinity and its impact on politics. So all of this was in the mix when we began work on political recruitment, but we were not self-consciously being feminist institutionalists. And in my case, it was just how I thought about things.
And why do you think we need feminist institutionalism? What value do you think it brings?
Well, I think feminist institutionalism shines a light on how power hierarchies are established and maintained by related sets of institutions. Now, these are very subtle processes, often opaque processes, but they have unsubtle outcomes that need to be understood and explained if we're going to understand how gender power relationships are to be changed. I think in this context that it's very important to name what we do, to make sure that it's recognized. This kind of naming, we are feminist institutionalists, as it were, also helps with field definition, and it encourages us to be systematic, to develop our theories, our concepts and models. It identifies our toolkits and our approaches. So just calling ourselves feminist institutionalism is the first step of an important process, first important step of a process.
And what do you think are some of the current or pressing challenges for feminist institutionalist scholarship?
Well, the obvious challenge is coverage. There's global coverage, there's institutional coverage, etc. There's also intersectional coverage. I mean, feminists also still believe that the personal is political, and that lens means that the range of institutions that are implicated in gender power imbalances is absolutely vast. So we need to cover a bigger range of institutions. We need to be more regionally and globally present. And we also need to cover different kinds of political systems. I'm very aware of this at the moment because so many of our once taken for granted institutions are under threat at the moment. Intersectionality is another challenge, and here I think the problem, insofar as there is one, is the sheer complexity of the interactions of diverse characteristics. Unraveling this is not a matter for fast, quick science. And a further challenge for political scientists really goes back to the so-called behavioral revolution and the buildup of prestige of big data quantitative projects, which is a set of preoccupations that squeezes out interests and context and the use of qualitative methods.
And what do you see as your aspirations for feminist institutionalist scholars and the FIIN network going forward?
Well, we now have some recognition, and FIIN is a huge part of this. We're also pretty good at mixed method research. We're producing really good stuff. We can meet the challenges that I have described. And I noticed recently that, at least in Europe, it's quite common to come across people who claim to be feminist institutionalists. They say it up front. That needs to be supported. We need to claim more for our work, and we need to continue to claim more for our work. And the book series will give us the means to make our claims. The Studies in Feminist Institutionalism series with Oxford University Press provides a home for feminist institutionalism as a distinctive approach to politics. It's crucial for advancing theory building, as well as showcasing new and exciting work in the field from established and early career scholars.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johnny, and thank you, Meryl, for that look back at the development of feminist institutionalism. And now we are going to look forward instead to the launch of the new book series, Oxford Studies in Feminist Institutionalism, co-edited by myself, Meryl Kenny, Fiona McKay, and Louise Chappell. And we decided to launch this book series because we felt there was a clear need for it. And we hope and think that you agree with us. And I mean, as we have heard now from so many different people, feminist institutionalism has gained increasing traction among senior, mid-career, and emerging scholars who really find it contributes to the exploration and understanding of politics, change, and stability across different institutional settings. And this seems to be the case also, or perhaps especially in the current turbulent times that we are in. So this series builds on a previous successful but time-limited mini-series with some great titles. So we know that there is both an authorship out there waiting as well as a readership for this series. We took forward the idea for this new book series in discussion with Andrea Schnapko at the Oxford University Press during ECPG in Amsterdam. And I'll leave it to Meryl to tell you a bit more about this.
Thanks, Ellen. If we can go to the next slide, please. There are, of course, a number of excellent gender politics book series in the field. Each of these provides important interventions and we think really demonstrate the vibrancy of and the growing audience for gender politics research more broadly. This series, Oxford Studies in Feminist Institutionalism, we think offers a distinctive contribution to this wider field by bringing together a tightly focused, a curated set of manuscripts that are linked by common conceptual frameworks and methodological concerns. And our aims and objectives, as you can see here, for FI research are to provide a home, as Johnny said, a brand for feminist institutionalism as a distinctive approach to politics, to consolidate, to refine, to advance core concepts and theory buildings, and to showcase this exciting work, these book-length case comparative studies from leading, emerging, and established scholars. Next slide, please. Beyond FI, we also want to promote dialogue with wider academic communities and with mainstream political science, which, as we've heard, was some of the kind of original origins around this project, and to engage practitioner communities with practical strategies for institutional reform and redesign. Next slide, please. As such, the coverage of the series focuses on three main strands: core, which are edited agenda-setting collections around conceptual themes, methodologies, research problems, and indeed, Ellen and I will be convening an upcoming workshop at the ECPR joint sessions, which we hope will feed into a potential volume on gender, institutions, and party politics. And that we hope this strand will be particularly valuable in teaching for upper-level undergraduate, master's level, and PhD students. Case monographs will develop extended applications of FI to single or comparative cases, including beyond the global north. And Connect edited volumes will build upon collaboration and dialogue with other disciplines, as well as with feminist policy practitioners, advocates, and actors working on specific issues. Next slide, please. So if you'd like to express interest in submitting a proposal to the series, please get in touch with the editors, and our details are also on the new website. Back to you, Ellen.
Yes. And of course, I mean, this series will be dependent on you as readers, and as well on us getting these excellent proposals. And we already have a few excellent proposals, and as you heard, there are some plans. But we're very happy to now be able to introduce you to our very first volume in the series, an excellent example of the case strand, Elise Stevenson's exciting new monograph on representing the nation, gendered institutions in international affairs. And Elise is now here to talk about her monograph and her experiences of the process of submitting to the series. So over to you, Elise.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak alongside such incredible people who've pioneered this research and theory. So for me, my book is all around Australian international affairs and applying feminist institutionalism to understand the gender dynamics and particularly women's leadership, considering, I guess, like many institutions and nations internationally, women's representation is increasing and in fact verging on parity. However, inequalities are not necessarily disappearing. So why? After studying women's leadership and gender relations across diplomacy, defence, national security, policing, intelligence, and other international affairs agencies, my book contributes empirical data from the past 30 years on women's representation in the Australian context, with in-depth interviews with almost 80 global leaders, plus crucial new feminist institutionalism insights derived through a critical feminist friend approach, courtesy of some of the brilliant scholars here tonight. And I've applied feminist institutionalism to multiple related institutions to be able to cut across diverse geographies, plus also time. This has brought some specific learnings for globalised and globalising government institutions, as well as institutions in decline, and some of the least studied, most male-dominated national security institutions of the state. But there are three other kind of core reasons why I find that this theory has been really helpful, or that I've been able to expand on. Firstly, I've been able to develop a framework, feminist institutionalist framework, to understand international landscapes that are highly complex and multi-layered. So developing a framework to analyse gendered rules at local, international, individual, agency and organisational, as well as industry-wide or field-level overlaps that may combine additively or provide pockets of resistance or escape from oppressive hierarchies. I've also provided a way to, analyse the evolution of not just institutions in flux or change, but also how inequalities evolve over time. Inequalities, gendered inequalities, don't necessarily change in nature, but they do in shape. And thirdly, as many spoke about already today, I promote a specifically intersectional feminist institutional approach that centres the analysis of gender in institutions, but not to the exclusion of all else. A kind of privileging of gender, a bringing in of other factors to go alongside it, though. This does build on much of the work already begun, however, brings in other salient factors like ethnicity or sexuality, for instance, whilst not losing sight of gender as a core lens of analysis, which is particularly important when studying international, inherently diverse institutions, which are deeply heteronormative and often have quite colonial roots that are unshakable even in new institutions. The process of applying for this special book series has been a really, I think, a nurturing experience and something where I've got a lot of guidance along the way to be able to develop my book to a point in which we are nearing a time in which we can publish. I think that this provides an opportunity for us as scholars to further the field. For me particularly, my book provides an opportunity to further the work of feminist institutionalism, but also a crucial analysis of gender in international institutions, given that there is such a great trend towards globalisation and some institutions in flux right now. In essence, I believe that who leads matters, and I think that we've got some really brilliant feminist institutionalism scholars here who can keep pushing this field forwards at a time in which a lot of gender dynamics and hierarchies across the world are in great flux. So I encourage anyone who does do research in this field to absolutely put yourselves forwards for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elise. And in the spirit of new directions for FI and furthering the field and looking forward, I'm now going to hand over to Sam Magic, who is an associate professor of political science at John Jay College, CUNY, and who will introduce us to and chair a panel of second-generation FI scholars.
There are 3 questions to go through. So the first question is the reasons that everybody was drawn to feminist institutionalism. And so in talking about this, I think it would be helpful when we hear from all of you, if you could talk about what your research area is generally and why you were drawn to feminist institutionalism. So Cecilia, would you want to start?
So I work in the field of gender and politics, and I initially started doing research on gender quotas. And sort of working within the field of gender and politics and being interested in how institutions, and in this case, a formal institution like a gender quota, structure and sort of gender political life, I think feminist institutionalism has provided me with sort of an important lens to see these sort of developments too. So that's been important. And also, the fact that I have more senior colleagues in my department, like Elin Bjarnegård and Josefina Eriksson, I've seen them sort of being part of developing feminist institutionalism and also use it in their work in a very fruitful way. That has, of course, sort of also inspired me in many ways and been sort of very important for me.
Great, thank you. Pedro, did you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, and my research is also on gender quotas in the beginning, so now it has moved in different directions. And I think as I was reflecting on this question, I think it was important to go back in the time period specifically, because I think I was a product of that time, and that was a confluence of things that really made feminist institutionalism really make sense for what I was doing. So this probably happened in 2009, 2010. I was in graduate school at the time in Kansas, and as I was developing my my research on women's underrepresentation in Brazil specifically, and why the gender quotas in Brazil were not successful. My graduate coursework was moving me towards new institutionalism, and the formal and informal institutions and all those things. And I was introduced to the beginning, to a certain extent, of the debate on feminist institutionalism in one of my courses, and started realizing that makes sense, right? So, and also at the same time, that was me starting to go to conferences, and then I met Mona Elena Crook and then Jennifer Piscopo and other people that are deep into feminist institutionalism, and so those interactions were very helpful too, right?
Great, thank you. And Jennifer.
Thanks. I guess I'm slightly different in slight contrast to Cecilia and Pedro, in the sense that initially my research was focused less on institutions and more on a particular policy area. So my doctoral thesis was looking at abortion policy, or the absence of abortion policy, perhaps more accurately in the context of Northern Ireland. But feminist institutionalism was helpful to me because I was thinking about that in the context of political decision making and the absence of political decision making. So it was very helpful to me to think about the particular institutional context in Northern Ireland and the ways in which that was established and how that acted as a barrier to thinking about gendered policy concerns, such as abortion. I think echoing Cecilia and Pedro as well, I think this is also to do with the particular context and time period in which I was writing my PhD thesis. Obviously, there's been a lot of work in the UK context on feminist institutionalism, and a lot of work at Westminster and in Scotland and Wales, but there had been less work in Northern Ireland. So I think in some ways I was kind of sort of trying to contribute to that conversation around feminist institutionalism across the UK context as a whole as well.
I think what everybody's brought up here is interesting in the sense of the broad context in which this theoretical frame is applicable. So I know two of you have talked about looking at it more in the formal legislative sense, in looking at quotas or in electoral politics versus in a policy area. And I know in my own work, I came to it, I don't even remember how, actually. I think maybe like you, Pedro, I was reading about new institutionalism for a project, and this gender angle was so interesting. But in my own work, actually, I first started using it when I was doing research on sex worker rights activism and sex workers in the nonprofit sector. And so, I took a lot of my data from that project, and I rethought how these nonprofits that were founded by sex worker activists, in fact, operated as gendered institutions that promoted very highly politicized and often politically complicated and challenging ideas about sex worker rights, even as they were funded by government agencies that had particularly gendered and negatively gendered practices against people in the sex industry. So I think what's been really interesting here is just all the different ways in which we've variously engaged with this area of research. I was wondering now if we could move then to talk about at least two different ways in which feminist institutionalism has been valuable in your current research. And we can start with Jennifer.
Sure. So thinking about, I guess, two ways kind of combined in one research project. Since my doctoral work, I've been working a lot more in the area of feminist international relations. And recently I've been doing some work with my colleague at the University of Bath, Sophie Whiting, and we've been looking at why anti-gender governments still choose to engage with gender equality measures. So we've been looking at Brazil and Poland, and why Brazil and Poland have still chosen to engage with the United Nations Women, Peace and Security agenda, despite the very pronounced anti-gender discourse of both contemporary governments. And a lot of work on the WPS agenda looks at it from the perspective of the kind of final completed policy product. Okay, it looks at it from the perspective of the national action plans that states produce around that work. And we think in the work we've been doing on this, we think that doesn't help us to explain why the agenda gets picked up in some places and not in others, and why some policy areas are focused on and not on others. So we think that the kind of methodological framework that feminist institutionalism provides is really important. And I think that kind of methodological aspect of FI is perhaps not seen as being perhaps as important as substantive contributions, but I think it is really important for kind of translating FI to other contexts and for giving us that kind of toolkit for thinking about how we understand the black box of the state, okay, how we understand the inner workings of things happening or not happening.
Great. Pedro.
Yes, and for me, like I always want to try to be careful because I feel like I'm so ingrained in FI that I don't do any work that doesn't approach FI even in my personal life, right? So there's understandings of formal and informal institutions, the concept of gendered logics, right? They continue to influence me, like I think in the scholarship, but also how I teach and in my service in higher education, kind of things I choose to do and how I choose to approach those things are kind of embedded in this conversation of gender as an institution, right? So even in some of publications that I don't use feminist institutionalism explicitly, this gender logics are still there, right? This gender understanding of gender institutions is still there. So I know for me, like FI, that is the one value is that it has really helped me center how I think about institutions, right? Currently one of my research projects is seeking to better understand the intersection of populism and masculinity. And again, there's insights of gender as an institution and the formal and informal rules and communication, especially. It's something that definitely moving in a different direction. So, most of my research has been in the current moment. Also, being a scholar of Brazilian politics, especially, the current moment also requires us to think about masculinity. But it's important to remember that masculinity is in this context of gender logics and gendered actors. So think about Bolsonaro specifically and his own like hyper masculine persona, or Donald Trump in the United States and his hyper masculine persona. How can we think about this from this context of feminist institutionalism is important. So yeah, so to me, like it's more than just a theoretical and methodological approach. It becomes really how a lens to see the world, a gender lens to see the world, that really helps me. And I honestly also I think as a cis man, that also helps me challenge even my own subconscious understandings of how the world works.
I feel, Pedro, just to say quickly, I feel like this is like when I teach my gender and politics class, and once the students, see what gender means, they can't unsee it anymore. Cecilia.
Yes, thank you. So I think in my current book project, I explore resistance to gender equality policy and women's political inclusion. And I do that by studying resistance to a gender quota policy in Uruguay. And I think that in this project, feminist institutionalism has sort of provided me with a framework or a way to sort of see the world that has helped me a whole lot of theorizing actors' sort of institutional room of maneuver and how that room of maneuver differs for men and women in this particular context. And it also sort of highlights how allows me to highlight how men strategically use formal and informal institutions to keep women out of politics and stop quota adoption and implementation in Uruguay. So in that project, it's really been sort of key in getting this, in highlighting these sort of dynamics. In another project, it has also been sort of super important. And this is the work I do with Josefina Eriksson about the gendered working environment in the Swedish parliament. And here I think FI has been of great help as that we have explored informal and very subtle gender inequalities in this sort of super gender equal parliament. But sort of despite being very subtle and despite being informal, we're able to show that this has great implications for men and women's possibilities to legislate on equal terms.
That's amazing. I'm just thinking of my own work, and I feel like I've moved into my more recent work is on celebrities and politics, actually. And so, gender has been all over this topic, but I've been focused, I guess, less on institutions and more on individual actors. But at the same time, I feel like, since I started engaging with feminist institutionalism probably over a decade ago now, it's really solved a lot of problems in my graduate student advising. And so I have I supervise a lot of students in the criminal justice doctoral program. And I can think of, one student right now, Lauren Moten, who is doing a project on human trafficking, what are called human trafficking intervention courts. And these are, populated mostly by defendants who are cis and trans women sex workers. And so, it's really been just this easy way to say to her, here are all the things you need to look for now in your research, and this will help you think about how these courts operate. And especially, with a lot of the students in a criminal justice context, it's really been invaluable in my advising work. I was wondering then maybe we should shift to talk about the gaps in feminist institutionalism, or even, things to build on more. And two things have already come up in this conversation. One is feminist institutionalism as method, I think is something that could be expanded well in the social sciences. And then Pedro, you said something really interesting about feminist institutionalism within our own university service, which we know is such a highly gendered phenomenon, with women, tending to do more kinds of service than men, and the different ways in which masculinity and femininity tend to play out in university service as well. So I'll open it up to anybody.
I guess I can start. And Sam, I think you mentioned your students, and the one direction I think, and we're seeing some research, I think it's a good example of that, is this intentional inclusion of intersectionality within feminist institutionalism, right? This is a good approach to delve into concepts that go beyond gender. So gender and race, gender identities, and all those, and then this different concept, class as well, right? But there also may be limitations, because if we're trying to explain too many things, we may be losing a little bit of parsimony over there, and that can be complicated when we're trying to do social science research, right? But I think we're seeing this a lot in research about minorities, more broadly speaking, right? We're seeing this move towards intersectionality that has, very important and interesting theoretical and methodological consequences, right? So I think FI could be a good tool to move that direction, to move to intersection identities, into intersectional discussions, and how institutions operate intersectionally.
That's great. Others?
I would just kind of echoing sort of what I was saying earlier, but I think it would be really exciting to see FI taken up more within feminist international relations. I don't think it's really used that much yet, but I think there's a lot of scope to do feminist institutionalist work within feminist international relations. I think a lot of the key substantive concerns within feminist IR are very much concerns that center around institutions. Even just, the military, for example, right? There's a plethora of work on the military within feminist IR, and thinking about that from the perspective of FI, I think would be really interesting and would provide a lot of new insights. But just also echoing what Pedro said earlier as well, like as you were talking, I was realizing that yes, I also think about feminist institutional ideas a lot when I'm thinking about my own academic institution, and particularly when I'm thinking about equality and diversity measures within my own academic institution. So I wonder if perhaps this is too navel gazing, but perhaps there should be some FI work specifically on the academy as a gendered institution.
Cecilia?
Yeah, no, I just like this point about intersectionality that really struck me this fall when I supervised a student who was doing work on intersectionality. And she was like, where's the FI literature on intersectionality? And like, I don't know. There is none. So I think that is an important sort of area for more FI engagement. Another thing that I've struggled with sort of in my own work is concerns how to sort of develop analytical tools to make FI more applicable in empirical research. I think it's a great provides a great lens through sort of by which we can sort of perceive the world. But at times, I think it's sort of a theory on a higher level that makes it difficult to sort of draw out expectations. So yeah, that is something I have sort of looked for and thought something that I've struggled with when applying an FI framework to my own work.
This point about intersectionality is really interesting because it leads me to think of one area I think feminist institutionalism can grow in, and I think that's an effort to move away from an idea of gender and sex binaries. And I know everybody who does FI, has a very sophisticated and definitely more sophisticated than most people in political science understanding of gender. But I feel like a lot of FI scholarship, and I would include my own in that, tends to talk very much about men, women, masculinity, and femininity. And I wonder, if more engagement with queer theory and ideas of challenging gender binaries and how institutions, may in fact do those things or not do those things might be, I think, a way to engage with a lot of the other critical scholarship in political science in sexuality studies, for example, and widen the community. And then, just with widening the community, I think this is something, and it's not the fault of feminist institutional scholars, but why can the mainstream institutional scholars not use this or get their head around this? Why is it? And I think, your point, Jennifer, about even feminist IR is kind of siloed from feminist institutionalism is just, it's just really interesting to think, why it has kind of remained in some ways for some people its own separate thing. And I don't know if anyone has thoughts or wants to talk about that.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and at a local level, for me, like I actually teach in an institution that it's two separate institutions. One is a men's college and one is a women's college.
Oh,
with a Catholic, Benedictine specifically dynamic, and we're struggling with this right now. We actually move into more integration, and a big part of the struggle is the embedded gender binary that exists, and how we're going to address this in the future, as the demographic of students is changing, right? And this is becoming also more accepted and more, students are coming in with these identities more fully formed, or at least more beyond the binary that we've been seeing. So I see this a lot, at the closer level possible, right? Both with students and how our institutions are trying, to address these issues. Yeah, I agree completely.
I agree with you completely about, frustrations about more mainstream scholarship not taking on board, FI considerations. And I don't think this is an answer, just an observation that I think, it's always been that way with feminist and gender work. FI is not unique in this regard. I think it's quite easy if you work in gender and politics, and that's kind of, your community and your subfield, it's quite easy to forget that there's a whole host of people that exist in the same discipline as you and never think about any of the things that we're thinking about. So it's not just FI, it's gender writ large, unfortunately.
And I think too, this goes back to just our, I guess, social and academic training. Like I know in my institution, when some students take POL 237, which is gender and politics, this is the first time they've ever thought about gender. But also to your point, Pedro, I think a lot of students are coming in definitely with more sophisticated and less binaristic understandings of how gender and sexuality show up in their own lives. And so I feel like there is this openness to it. But if we look at, scholars, let's just say our age, right? We definitely, I know I stumbled on gender studies when I was in college, and I was a political science major, and there was, very little. And so that just carries through your graduate training. And so, I think the fault is kind of with us and our training as well.
Yeah, something that you mentioned, and I think that's part of sometimes a struggle within feminist institutionalism. We are, collectively, we're scholars, and the scholarship we're trying to build is trying to engage with mainstream political science, right? So we're kind of embedding ourselves with new institutionalism and just kind of making the point that gender is an institution and we need to engage that. And that may be also a limitation when trying to engage with critical scholarship, right? Where if we're trying to be mainstream, we may not be able to be methodologically, and theoretically as critical, right? So it is. I feel that is a tension that some scholars talk about this more directly, but I'm guessing many of us struggle with that, to like where where do we want to send our our research to, and is it too critical, is it too mainstream? So we're in this middle ground too.
Well, it's great to meet you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Good seeing everybody.
Take care. Bye.
What a fantastic conversation that was. And if you do want to watch that again, that'll all be up on our website, that you'll be able to watch it over and engage in that really fascinating discussion between all of those wonderful scholars. We now are moving on to the next section, which is also about some fascinating cases that have been developed using an FI approach. And I'm going to hand it over to Georgina Whalen, one of the other co-directors of the FIIN network, to introduce those cases. Over to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Louise. I'm not going to say very much. I'm conscious of time, but I'm very happy to introduce this roundtable that features 5 great scholars, which, as Louise says, use different methods and cases, talking about how they use FI in their research, focusing on different kinds of formal and informal rules and critical junctures, for example, in different contexts. So ranging from the Pacific, Vietnam, and the comparison of analysis of Sharia law, amongst other things. So go straight into the films.
Our book, Cabinets, Ministers, and Gender, used a feminist institutionalist approach to explain how formal and informal rules surrounding cabinet appointments changed over time and across countries. We wanted to know how cabinets went from having no women to having one woman to having many and perhaps even an equal number of men and women in cabinet. Using a feminist institutionalist approach allowed us to see not just how the informal and informal rules created gendered advantages or disadvantages, but also how political actors used those rules in ways that allowed them to create change over time. So for us, the real value of a feminist institutionalist approach is the space it created for political agency, which is crucial for those of us who want to understand how gendered institutions change for the better.
One of the most important contributions of feminist institutionalism has been around informal rules. These are the rules that are not written down anywhere in constitutions or statutes, but are nevertheless well understood and shared and followed by actors working in a particular institutional setting. They're abundant and they're really powerful, and they also shape gendered relationships in institutional settings. We use the understanding of informal rules in our work on cabinets, ministers, and gender. We wanted to understand how ministers are recruited to cabinet. Why are some people picked rather than others? And there are no rules, written rules, that determine the process of ministerial recruitment. And using feminist institutionalism and that understanding of informal rules, we were able to excavate and understand the rules that actors within the institution of cabinets follow in the process of recruiting ministers to cabinet, and also why this over time and in different countries has meant that more women are recruited to cabinet in some instances than they are in others. So, feminist institutionalism, thank you for your work to help us understand informal rules.
So really what I'm doing is aiming to understand how regulation occurs at different scales in Pacific Island societies in recognition of the fact that these are highly pluralized regulatory settings. And the three questions that I have developed to sort of capture the nature of and complexity of regulation in these contexts are, firstly, how has the state developed a formalized response to gender violence? How does that formalized response of formalized system of regulation interplay with other sites of rulemaking that exist beyond the state? And then the third question that I ask aims to join up the study by thinking about how regulation is lived by women in everyday contexts. So I ask, how do women in everyday contexts navigate the systems of gendered regulation that order their lives to achieve security from violence? The first phase of the study aims to map the regulatory ecology that is in place in each jurisdiction. So I draw on Vivian Lowndes' work on different rule typologies. So I look at the presence of regulatory rules, formalized rules in law, obligatory rules, norms and practice, and persuasive rules, symbol and narrative. And I ask how all of these systems of rules are pertinent to the regulation of violence in gender violence in each case study jurisdiction. So just a slide there to kind of capture the nature and the complexity of the regulatory ecology in each of my case study jurisdictions, which is shaped by complex post-colonial histories and a range of institutions at different scales, from the international, the national, down to the local village-based institutions in each case study site. With the second phase of the study, which is really focused on how everyday women experience and navigate rulemaking ecologies. And to do this, I've used a photo elicitation methodology. And what this has revealed is, when women are asked questions about, the security or insecurity of women in each of these images and what they might do to manage potential experiences of violence, it's been very interesting to see what are the sorts of rules they invoke and what scale of rulemaking is most important to them. What we've found is often it's the obligatory and persuasive rules that they talk about and the localized scales of rulemaking, so that, the reforms that have been enacted at the state level might not be the most important to those women, or the rulemaking that happens at the local level mediates the effectiveness of that rulemaking environment at the scale of rulemaking at the national level. However, what I've also found, and what I think is a real contribution of this study, is that the obligatory and persuasive rules operating in localized contexts can also be sources of security for women. So while they might sometimes, in some forms, mediate the effectiveness of state rulemaking, the results of this study really open up, I think, important questions about domains of rulemaking and how those localized domains can be meaningful for the regulation of violence. Thank you for your attention today and for the opportunity to present on this research.
The research combines a feminist institutionalist conceptual framework which identifies the interplays of formal and informal gender rules and practices with a policy process approach to understand why targets for women's leaders have not been met at different stages of the employment life cycle. It combines primary and secondary data from focused group discussions and in-depth interviews with female officials working in the public agencies in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, as well as a workshop with Vietnamese and Australian public sector women leaders in Canberra. This project focuses specifically on gendered formal and informal institutions. Gender institutions can be formal, such as the case in Vietnam of women having earlier retirement age than men. Gender institutions can also be informal. An example in Vietnam is that some people see the roles of the heads of an organization as a man's job. Thus, some people find hard to imagine a female director general, but usually as a deputy head of an organization. Expectations that women are not as ambitious as men are also examples of informal gender institutions which influence leadership outcomes. The research also has identified rules about gender, such as Vietnamese retirement rules, which stipulate women have a 5-year lower retirement age than men, is an example of formal rules about gender. And the expectations that women undertake primary care responsibilities is an informal rules about gender. Our research also identifies neutral rules, which can have gender effects. In Vietnam, an example of formal rules with gender effects is the requirement of 1 to 2 years rotation far from one's organization or one's home before one is being appointed to leadership positions. This rule does not distinguish between men and women, but because of the interaction with the wider institutional context, it creates different outcomes for men and women, where much less women can meet the rotation requirement than men due to women's care roles in their families. In terms of informal rules with gender effects, an example is the Vietnamese networking practices, where men often gather after work to enjoy socializing and sharing work opportunities, whereas women do not enjoy similar opportunities because they are usually involved in care labor. This research has indicated that the interplay between these formal and informal gender institutions have created critical barriers to women's leadership in Vietnam. The research also identifies measures to overcoming these barriers.
My research explores the Sharia debates in the West with a focus on Australia, Canada, and the UK, with a particular focus on Muslim women's agency. If we look at the existing literature and discussions around Muslim women's rights and agency, they tend to go around in circles, often asking questions like, do Muslim women need saving? Or is multiculturalism bad for women? In doing so, they tend to overlook the way that Muslim women within these contexts can and do exercise agency and navigate state and religious institutions in their everyday lives. By looking at institutions, we can really go beyond these tired questions and get a better idea of the gendered norms that emerge from both religious and state institutions. This is where feminist institutionalism provides the valuable lens and framework through which to consider how Muslim women's agency is shaped and constrained by these institutions. The formal institutions that I focus on in my research are state policies of multiculturalism, as well as family law. As these are where the Sharia debates tend to be concentrated. I also compare informal Sharia bodies, like those that have emerged in Britain, to state family law structures, and consider issues such as power, accountability, and transparency. What has been particularly useful in my research is the FI notion of gendered historical legacies that permeate formal institutions. So this is the idea that even where there are institutional changes or the emergence of seemingly new institutions, there is a nested newness whereby institutions are prone to remembering the old. To give an example of this, within the Sharia debates, there is a focus on multiculturalism and the accommodation of Muslim communities. So as I said, one formal institution I consider estate policies of multiculturalism. Drawing on FI theory, I consider the way in which historical legacies and breakpoints influence these policies and the way in which this is gendered. Specifically, I consider the rise and influence of Islamophobia in the post-9/11 world as a critical juncture and consider the way that this has shifted the focus of these policies onto Muslim communities and affected Muslim women through the inherently gendered nature of Islamophobia. Fundamentally, FI allows me to get a better understanding of the importance of the institutional landscape and consider the way that laws produce gendered effects, the way that state policies can lead to gendered outcomes, and the role that gendered actors play in constraining women's agency.
Well, thanks to all of those contributors. I think they have shown us how far FI can travel. We go from a liberal democracy to a single-party state in Vietnam to the Pacific arena, as well as a case there from Amira talking about intersectionality between religion and gender. So I think we are developing those more nuanced and complex cases that people are calling out for, which is really exciting. And we hope to see a lot more of that in the future of FIIN and in our book series as well. So Fiona, I'd like to hand over to you now to just say a few final words. And again, just before I end, I want to thank everyone here behind the scenes this evening, allowing this event to go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks. So on behalf of Louise and me and our co-directors, just a big thank you to all of you as our wonderful presenters, participants, organisers. So thank you for helping us to celebrate the distance we've travelled and also to map out the road, or I think more importantly, the roads that we have ahead that we can travel to continue to explore and develop FI as this collective enterprise for understanding, exposing and redressing the gendered and intersectional power inequalities in public and political life. So thank you, and depending where you are, good morning, good afternoon and good night.